Hey, welcome to the show, everybody. My name is Mike Phillips. This is the Leadership Toolkit, as you know, the definitive leadership podcast for you to help grow yourself. You can learn from people's successes. You can learn from their failures. I have a bunch of awesome people from many different verticals of business that are gracious enough to spend their time chatting with me for your benefit so that you can help grow yourself and grow your team. So today I have a really exciting guest. He's an absolutely visionary integrator. He's a leader. He's an executive, an entrepreneur, a professional business coach. He's a husband, a father, and so much more. I'm excited to welcome to the show with me today, Mr. Lee Partee. Lee, welcome to the show with me today on the Leadership Toolkit, man.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. I'm so appreciative that you're willing to invest the time with me and the audience this afternoon and talk about who you are, what you do, leadership. You've got an absolutely phenomenal story. You and I talked a little bit beforehand, so I'm excited to get in there and just from where you've come and the way you coach people, and we have a connection because certainly I'm very rooted in my faith, as I know you are too. So if you would spend just a couple of minutes here and share with the audience kind of who you are, what you do, what's your background in leadership, and let's get into jamming and talking about leadership, sales, management, entrepreneurship.
Well, again, thank you for having me on. As you mentioned, I'm married, and my wife and I share 8 children. We've been together for a little over 22 years, married, but we celebrate 25th anniversary of our first date here on May 1st, so we're excited about that. Um, my background really is entrepreneurial based. Started a few different companies. I've had some succeed, I've had some fail, but at the end of it all, it's all worked out, and here we are today working with friends. It's always great to work with friends who we focus on helping people who are in recovery. And I also do, like you said, some coaching, consulting, and advising to other business owners, really around just organizational structure,
Mm-hmm.
um, leading your sales and marketing teams, but also just their individual leadership and what they need as a one-on-one coach. Because sometimes, as you know, Mike, you talk to so many leaders on your show. Being a leader, especially in a smaller business, can get very lonely. And
Yeah.
so we try to offer solutions to help them not feel so lonely and work through the issues that they have to deal with as owners and executives of small businesses.
That's awesome, man. And so let me ask you, we're going to get right into it. First off, when you're saying, hey, as I know, it can feel sort of, we've all heard the saying lonely at the top. What are some tools right out of the gate? Because you said, hey, we do some things to help leaders not feel so lonely. What would be two, three, four things, maybe some tools specific to someone that is in a leadership role, whether it's small business or if they're just coming into leadership, we want to equip people coming into that role that you would recommend, say, hey, do this, or do this, because that can help you stay fulfilled and connected.
Well, I think one of the big things is make sure you find a solid mentor, someone that you can really pour your heart out to, not just seek business advice to or from. And so I think finding a solid mentor or even two is a really great idea. And then after you find that mentor, I would back that foundation up with 2 to 3 really solid advisors who are going to know your business, who are going to be willing to let you explain your problems to them, and then give you feedback. And whether that feedback is what you want to hear or whether that feedback is what you need to hear, that's just as equally as important. The other big thing as a leader, as much as it's possible with that group of people, and including if you're married, your spouse, you need to have full transparency. One of the big failures of my life for a long time is I wasn't transparent. I acted more as a lone wolf. And so having a mentor today and having advisors around me and having transparency in my life, and sometimes to a fault, it's really important to have those 3 main things. And then the other thing is you have to find a way to where you don't need anyone to motivate you to get up and go do what you do in the morning. You shouldn't need someone telling you, hey, you need to get up and go do this. And I think that just comes from making sure you're working on something that you're passionate about and working from a basis of discipline.
Those are awesome. I'm just going to recap. So if anybody is listening either now or later on the show, and certainly as always, if anybody's got questions or comments, just feel free to drop them in the chat. We've got a few people tuned in and checking us out. So if you end up with questions, you go, man, I've got this burning desire to ask Lee this thing because he'd be awesome at answering it. Please feel free to do that. Also, before we get too far in, let me find this here. If anyone's interested in connecting with Lee, you can find him at linkedin.com/n/LEE Partee. Lee Partee. And then I'll share some other connective ways as we get going. I think that's really good advice. The fact that you said, and I've had other leaders say this, you got to find a solid mentor. And I like that you added or two. And I've heard sometimes people say even up to 5, right? Sometimes you need a mentor for relationships and one for business and one for finances and one for, so I think that's really valuable, because a lot of times leaders, part of the reason it's lonely is we get there and there's this sort of expectation. People think, well, that Lee's made it. He knows everything, right? Who else do you need in your life? And so I think that's very valuable in saying
Well,
find a solid mentor.
I'd be remiss to say that I've made it. I think we'll make it one day, hopefully, when I'm standing before Jesus. But until then,
Exactly.
having mentors and valuable people who you can rely on is a lifelong mission.
Sure. No, and I say that complimentary because a lot of times people see us or they're listening to the podcast and they go, "Oh man, that's awesome. I want to be there." I also like the fact that you said 2 or 3 advisors. What's the difference between having someone that is a mentor and someone that's an advisor? Can you specify that?
Sure. So I really poured myself when I went through a period of time of struggle, and how do I rebuild things? And the mentor is someone who they hear everything. And an advisor might be someone who hears everything about one particular topic.
Got it.
And to me, I have 2 really strong mentors in my life. One happens to be a good friend of mine who's also my pastor, but he isn't just a pastor; he has a lot of business experience. So when I talk to him about life in general, he's able to give me feedback in every front. The other one's more business, but he's also a really strong Christian brother, and so he raised a large family. So again, it's similar situation, but they've already been there, done that, and those guys I would tell anything to. An advisor
Sure.
might be, hey, I've got this business problem and I need to restructure this debt for this company. How would you
Yeah.
do that? And they're going to give me advice specific to that issue. Or, hey, we need to bring in benefits for our employees. Where should we do that? How should that look? What should that feel like before we go talk to 5 different insurance companies about how that's going to feel? And so I think that's the difference for me. A mentor hears everything, supports everything, and gives you feedback on everything. And an advisor is more topic specific.
That's a really good definition, really good differentiation there. When you're looking for a mentor, well, before I go too far, the third thing you said was you got to find that passion so that you're essentially, you said this without saying it, but being self-motivated as a leader, it is somebody that like you got to find that gas from somewhere. I've always said passion is the fuel that keeps you going, right?
That's right.
So I think those are just very, very valuable, and I'm going to circle around those for a few minutes, if we may. When you're looking for a mentor, because you're saying, hey, this person sees everything, they're honest with everything. I love the fact that you said sometimes they tell you what you need to know, not what you want to hear. I think that is just excellent advice. When you're searching for a mentor, what are a couple of things that you look for in someone that you say, hey, I want this person to help mentor me? And then do you have that direct a conversation with somebody? Do you say, hey, I want you to mentor me? Or how do you approach that?
Well, I think that for me, before you approach them, you want to make sure there's alignment, and alignment in your spiritual sense, alignment in your emotional sense, and alignment in your professional sense. And so, I think that when someone is seeking someone out, they need to be willing to be relational and vulnerable, but they also should be seeking someone out that is at a level that they're not at. So like my mentors are guys who, if you look at the holistic picture of their life, not just their business successes, not just whether or not they're rich or, whatever. My mentors are guys of like, they're at least 10 years older than I am. Number one, they've got a lot more experience in life than I do, but they're also at a level where I'm trying to go. And so that doesn't mean they're your mentor for life, but they're at least a level or two above where you are at, so that way they can pull you to that level and work with you in that way. I think that's really what you're looking for when you're trying to identify someone who would be a good mentor. Um, to your other question, how do you approach it? I think you need to start a relationship with them. That might
Mhm.
be, hey, I would like to get your advice on this topic, and can I take you out for coffee? And start approaching them. And then if you feel that there's a sense there that there's alignment and some unity, talk to some guys that know them, ask them their opinion if they'd be a good mentor. Kind of do your homework, so to speak, and who you're picking before you go to them and say, hey, I want you to be my guy. And you may
Yeah.
not realize that that wasn't the best thing to ask. So I think that when you're looking at all that, it's really about alignment and those three key areas: spiritual, emotional, and professional. And then it's developing the relationship. And you always want to find someone who's at a level, at least two levels higher than you, and probably has 10-year age gap on you. That way, there's experience that's built into their mentorship.
I love that, man. I absolutely love that. I have not had somebody say that specifically to me. And so when people are listening to this and they're watching this, that's one of the things that I've said so many times on the show. I learn as much from my guests as I hope my audience learns when we're having these conversations. Because I've had a lot of people bring up, Lee, that they say, well, you have to find a mentor, and everybody has sort of a process. I absolutely love the fact that you said they need to be uh, probably your senior by at least 10 years, and that they got to be levels above you. So depending on that piece that you're looking for, if it's financial, you can't have someone at the same level of you mentoring you and coaching you in a financial situation while you're in the same place that you're. And you said that the mentor has to pull you to that place. And I think
Mhm.
that's, from a leadership viewpoint, it's important for all of us to remember then, like we have to be humble enough to bruise our ego enough, be humble enough to allow ourselves to be pulled, right?
100%. You can't play tug of war, with the guy who's trying to help you get better in life, right? And so otherwise, you're just wasting time, his and yours, or theirs and yours, I guess. So it's a tug of war is not what you want to be doing. The in the Bible it talks about humbling yourself, and
Mm-hmm.
humility when you're seeking a mentor and you're trying to ask someone to pour into you. Humility is the very first thing that should be in front of you. There's a book out there that talks about level 5 leadership, right? Level 5 leadership, one of the biggest keys to that is humility. It's not about me anymore. It's about this thing that's bigger than me. And that may
Right.
be your legacy for your family. That may be the organization that you lead succeeding in a certain way. Whatever that is, it cannot come from a basis of selfish ambition, but it can only come from a basis of humility and overall push and drive for the overall success of the thing, not just your success in the thing.
It's that real attitude of service and look, how do I move this person in this thing, like you said, whatever the thing is, if it is business, is if it is spiritually, emotionally. That's just so good. I want to ask you on the third one, because you said, hey, you got to be self-motivated. So if the mentor helps pull you, right, that motivation helps push you, right? That's the fuel that keeps you going. So if what are some things that you do each day to help keep yourself motivated? Because I know there's sometimes this intrinsic force. We go, well, I'm just going because I know what I'm going after. Are there some physical activities that you engage in as a leader to help keep yourself being propelled forward? What are some of those things?
Well, on a daily basis, I think it's not so much that it's a physical activity for me, but it's really spending time first thing in the morning or first thing when I get up, taking 30 minutes just to have quiet time and reflect in a moment of prayer, and just getting your mind placed in the right spot for the day, that whatever may come, you're going to be able to deal with and handle. Um, I'm a big guy, so I'm clearly not in the gym every day. I should be, but hasn't happened yet. I'm not like the sales gurus are going to tell you got to get up at 3:30 in the morning and you got to be, do all this big littlest thing by 4:30, and like, no, you need to take 30 minutes though, I think, when you get up, and really spend that in quiet reflection. It's hard to do. I'm not going to say you need to put your cell phone down, because I use my cell phone to read my Bible some mornings, but
Sure.
I think it's more about, don't get engaged in streaming and get engaged in social media and all these other things. Just take time to reflect on what's in front of you that day. Be grateful, express gratitude for what God's given you in that moment, and really focus on what's in front of you and what's present. The past is the past. Tomorrow we don't know, but we're here today. And so I think it's really being focused on the present that's most important every single day.
That's really, really valuable. The fact that, because I think just societally, we end up that there's that constant, if you're saying, hey, a mentor should pull us to where they want to go, I love the fact that you said tug of war. I think we have a daily tug of war because we get pulled different directions, right? Oh, this on social media, squirrel, right? And we're headed off into these different directions. And the fact, we have all heard people say it, and you've heard people say it, right? You got to get your mind right first. And I think that's very valuable too, because I also am not one of the guys that says, well, I've got to, and I've had some people on this program that are just amazing that say, oh yeah, I've got this 2.5 hour routine, but they also acknowledge that's not for everybody. And
Sure.
much like you, 30 minutes, like you're saying, hey, quiet time. There's so much going on in our minds. There's so much going on in social media. It's worthwhile to take just a moment and hear yourself think, and I like the fact that you said to reflect on stuff. So I think um, that's really good. You mentioned also, and I'm going to share this with people in the chat here in a minute. You said there's a book on level 5 leadership. Are you referring to John Maxwell, or is that a
Uh,
different book?
no, it's a different book. It's written by, hang on one second. It
Sure.
caught me off guard.
That's
That's all
okay.
right.
While you're looking
Um,
that up, because I'm curious, I want to be able to share that. Um, just a reminder for folks that are either watching or listening to the podcast as well. You can connect. Lee Partee here is he's on csuiteforchrist.com also as a speaker, and you can go csuiteforchrist.com/speaker/LEE-PARTEE. So if you want to connect with him there. And then we talked beforehand, he said it's okay to call or text him. So the cell phone up there is 216-258-2989. I would advise you, with all the calls that fly around out there, maybe shoot him a text first if you're going to connect and say, hey man, saw you on the show, or I'd love to connect and get your take on this and so forth.
yeah,
So
text is always best, because that's the easiest way to get a hold of me a lot of
sure
times.
thing.
The book is written by Jim Collins. It's From Good to
Oh,
Great.
gotcha.
And it talks about level 5 leadership.
Oh,
And then
gotcha.
he's
Gotcha.
got a
Yep.
series of books of, like Built to Last, Turning the Flywheel, Great by Choice. All those books are really, really, really strong options that any entrepreneur should read. But the level 5 leadership mentality I was speaking from was by Jim Collins.
Gotcha.
And great.
Yep. No, I want to share that because there's a lot of references to good books. And one thing I find is people that, I know this can sound a little cheesy, but leaders are readers, right? We always take
Right.
in a lot of information and are deliberate with it. So no, that's good. I'm a big John Maxwell fan. So when you said level 5 leadership, that's where my head went, was the 5 levels of leadership with him. But I know exactly what you're talking about with the reference to level 5 leadership and good to great. So you brought up earlier, you said, hey, one of the things when you're looking for a mentor, and I imagine one of the things when you have someone that you are allowing to lead you, that you're looking to follow and so forth, one of the things you brought up was humility. What are 3 or 4 other characteristics that you would say are absolute defining characteristics when you are looking for somebody to either lead you, be in a leadership role, promote into a leadership role? Because there's different angles to this. So what are some defining characteristics? And I'm going to put one as humility, not to steal that from you, but since you mentioned it earlier, I think that's probably, you can repeat it though.
Well, I think the next one really is the character of the person. Who are they? What do they stand for? And then the next one naturally after character is integrity, because who they are and what they stand for, integrity is how they live that out. So you have humility, character, and integrity. I think that some ones that are equally as important but are kind of offshoots of those three
Yeah.
are honesty, transparency, and even vulnerability, the willingness to be vulnerable. And then depending on what you're leading or who's leading you, you want to see that they have a good combination of empathy. They're able to be sympathetic to not only your needs, but the needs of others. So I think those are the core groups that I would really
Sure.
want to focus on, whether I'm seeking out someone as a mentor or an advisor, or whether I'm looking to hire somebody into a role. Those are my core belief things that we need to look at. You don't want to I've been around sales a lot in my career, for example, and sales guys are a special breed. And, sometimes they come in and they're the latest, greatest, biggest hot shot in the world. And you find out that, yeah, you may be really good at closing people, but, how are you living your life? And unfortunately, there's more cases than not sometimes where that's just not a good situation. So I think too many people get promoted based on how they've performed a duty versus how they're living life. And I think that's
Yeah.
important to really look at holistically when especially when you're promoting into leadership roles, whether it be head of a team or whether it be head of a department or head of a company. You definitely want to be focusing on those core things.
That is absolutely excellent. And I love the fact that you said, hey, people get promoted based on how they perform a duty or maybe a collection of duties, right? Versus how they're living life. If you're a entrepreneur, you're a CEO, you're somebody that's in a head leadership role, let's say, and you're looking to bring somebody along with you, and you say, okay, well, this person's due for a promotion. Lee's done excellent in his duties, and you're thinking of promoting them. How can you get to a place where you know how they're living their life? Like, how can you gauge that rather than just looking at how they perform duties at work?
Well, I'm a I think one of the major problems we have in corporate America today, and in general, I'm being very generalized here, not specifically trying to say something, but
Sure.
we don't know each other anymore. It's the same situation as, in your own neighborhood. A lot of us don't even know who our neighbors are anymore, let alone what's going on in their lives. And so I think as a leader who's looking to promote, or an entrepreneur who's founded a company, he's got it to a certain point, and now he needs to bring in some executive team talent and things of that nature. You need to spend time building a relationship with these people and really getting to know them on a personal level. And that's where the vulnerability and the willingness to be transparent comes in, right? So if we're unwilling to do that as the people who are doing the hiring, we can't expect the people that we're hiring to be willing to do that either. And so I think one of the key things as a leader, you should be willing to get in to know people's lives, know their situation, know what's going on, and carry a professional level of empathy along with that. Not that you're being a pushover, you're letting anything go, but you're at least understanding the dynamic of what's going on in their life, and you're adjusting the needs of their role and the needs of the company and the needs of the position around that, giving them the best chance for success at every level, not just there at work.
That's very good. I know I appreciate you taking the time to share that because I agree with you. We've become just as humans, like we're at this weird time in history where we're so connected because it's like the what do they say, the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon or whatever, six
Yeah,
degrees of
6 degrees
separation,
separation. Yep.
right? And so you can connect to everybody because there's social media and there's email, and like LinkedIn is unbelievable where you can quote unquote connect with somebody but you mentioned like, hey, but people don't even know their neighbors. So it's like we're at this most connected time in history, but we're so disconnected and segmented.
Yep.
And I think it's very valuable that you point that out. And for anybody listening to the show, I would encourage you, hear that, write that down, like take the time to really connect. The gosh, I had a guy on the show, I want to say last week, maybe it was the week before, and he said, communication is connection. And so like that's one of the things when you actually connect with people, and you're where you said vulnerability, I think there's a fine line of vulnerability. Like, how vulnerable should somebody be, Lee? Like, when you're talking about vulnerability, can you take just a second and kind of define how you view that? And then how vulnerable should a leader be? Because there's a difference between being not vulnerable at all, which comes off probably as overconfidence or arrogance. And there's probably a line of too vulnerable, which is sort of this wishy-washy marshmallow that you don't want to follow. So how do you define that, and how vulnerable should a good leader be?
Well, I think your definition of vulnerability comes from what boundaries are you setting? You know, you have to be willing to be the boss if you're the boss, but at the same time, you have to be willing to be a friend if they need a friend. And I think that if you clearly set some expectations and you really lay down clear boundaries, that you
Mm-hmm.
can be, you and I could work together fine, and I could tell you about issues that I might be dealing with as a man or as a husband or as a father, and I would welcome your feedback, right? And I think that's okay in the workplace. I think we've gotten to a point where too many people have made that kind of stuff not okay. And
Right.
it makes people not care about their jobs. It makes, the quiet quitting idea gets around to like there's no relationship anymore, so why do I care what happens to XYZ company? You know, so I think we need to bring back some of the vulnerability and the friendship aspect that work creates. To me, I, I'm fairly open book. People can Google me, people can look things up, people can ask me questions. I'm going to answer you. You may not
Sure.
like it, right? You, you may not like my response, but I'm going to always give an answer for anything that someone asks me. Not necessarily right away, but I'm taking time to think things through if it's a complicated question. Um, but I think it's really about we need to bring friendship, professional friendship, back into the workplace and back into the marketplace, because that professional friendship, at least from my perspective, as being really faith driven, leads into opportunities for us to share our faith, share our struggle, because it's not always about our successes, it's also about learning from the struggles that we have. And I think that more and more people need to be willing to open up the conversation of what does it mean to be this person's friend. What does it mean to love my neighbor? And we can love our neighbor professionally, but we can also love our neighbor when we see them hurting and be willing to go to them and say, hey, what can I do to help you in this moment? Is it just sitting here? Is it having a conversation? Is it, me praying for you? Is it us praying together? What does that look like? But too often it's, Johnny has this issue and we're not going to talk about it. Yes, his work's slacked, but that's his work. That's not Johnny. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
we need to get more back into a holistic view of people, bring professional friendship back into places, not just what can I get out of a person, but what can I pour into them, and expand that across our entire life, right? Whether it's our neighbor, whether it's people in our family, whether it's people in our office. So that's really when I talk about vulnerability, that's what I'm talking about. Be willing to be open and transparent and pour into others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people are much more willing to connect and be and reciprocate that. When you as a leader display that, people are willing to reciprocate that. Ironically, like in my time in the auto dealership, one of the things that I always had salespeople do, or I always had call center people do, is when we come into business, it's so often this sterile environment. And you probably see this going into different businesses and speaking and doing this kind of stuff. Like where there's this sterile environment. Here's the cubicle. This is where you belong, and you're doing whatever the thing is that you do. And I always, a little bit in jest, would say, but there's some seriousness to it. I'd be like, listen, man, you need to bring in pictures of your family and your awards and all the stuff, like plaster the walls with that stuff for two reasons. One, I want to know who you are. And two, if you get really mad at me, you just can't blow out of here. You got to take time packing your stuff and put it, and we'd all laugh about it. And they're like, is this guy serious? And I'm like, 100%, you know?
Absolutely.
And so it's a little bit tongue in cheek and it's fun, but it's like those sorts of things. So often now businesses are like, well, we have this policy. You can't have that on the wall. You can't do this. You can't do that. And it's like, man, what happened to the humanity? And I think some of it, I promise I'm not going to steer this down a political conversation, but I think on the outside, right, with social media, with politics, with the news, with that, like the goal is divide and conquer. They want to divide people. All right, government higher ups, large corporations, and so forth want to be able to divide people, because then we do stop talking. We do stop communicating. We stop connecting with our neighbor and the people at work. So I think that's a really, really valuable point that you bring up there.
Well, I would expand it further. I think not much good came out of the COVID crisis. To me professionally, one of the things that came out good though was this type of ability. I'm sitting in my office in Ohio, and you're sitting in your office in Colorado, and
Yeah.
we're having a conversation like you're right next to me, right? So I think there's some positives that came out of this from a technology standpoint, but I'm still huge. I mean, huge on the first time I'm going to meet with someone, it has to be face to face if possible. I prefer to have face to face and then use technology to foster the relationship. Getting
Absolutely.
that face to face interaction, that ability to have coffee with someone, or a lunch or breakfast or whatever it may be. There's just something about that. We've been created to be relational beings, and it's hard to be relational when all we're doing is talking to a gigantic monitor with a camera on top of it, like I am today.
Right. And it's funny too, because there's two things, and I want to share this with the audience, or a couple things. That's why I always end up looking here rather than here all the time, is because you're looking at that, like I got to look at your face while we're communicating. But one thing, and you absolutely personify this, and you before we got on the show, and just so everybody knows, what, like, Lee practices what he preaches, because we were talking about getting together, and I think you either emailed me or messaged me and said, hey, thinking about coming on the show. I'd just like to talk about it first. And again, you're in Ohio, I'm in Colorado, so we can't have that face to face, but we did have a voice to voice. Like immediately you called me, you said, let's talk. I think we talked for like an hour, right?
Yep.
I mean, just sitting and having a conversation about life and the things that happen. And to me, at the end of that conversation, I was like 100%. I really hope that, and at the time, like before we had more of a relationship, I'm thinking to myself, man, I really hope he books on the show. And you did almost immediately, which was great. And it led us to this conversation, which is awesome to be able to enhance our initial relationship and hopefully a long, long friendship. And then also the fact that it allows you to bring your wisdom to other people. It's just a different platform. So it's awesome. And you do practice what you preach, which I think is great. A couple things you brought up. You're welcome. And I don't know which direction I want to go just because we have limited time. Like I said, we could jam for a while. One of the things that you did bring up, and we were talking earlier, you said, hey, you can learn from people's successes. You can learn from their struggles. Can you share with the audience what is a struggle that you have experienced that you've maybe overcome, and what did you learn from that? What was the approach, and how were you able to crash through that?
Well, from whether it's screwing up a deal in a sales, type of issue where you're trying to sell a customer and you mess something up,
Mm-hmm.
or whether it's something even more major in life, I think that you learn more in the failure and the struggle than you ever do in the success. My biggest failure from a world perspective, I guess, is that I was in the mortgage and lending business when the financial crisis happened in 08 and 09. And the company I was leading, we made a lot of mistakes. And that ultimately, over time, led to me having to work out a deal with the federal government to spend some time for wire fraud in federal prison. And I went in there, first of all, humiliated. The greatest failure
Sure.
of my life has just happened, right? Not including the personal aspects of that in my marriage and in my family uh, and friendships. But I went in there and, God really did a major thing in my life and it opened my eyes. I used to be like someone that went to prison, went, or had some issue like that. I used to be very judgmental of, and I became one of those people. And it really opened my eyes to realize that as humans, we are all broken, and we all suffer from being incarcerated in some way. It might be in our thoughts, it might be in our, a role that we're not happy with. It might be in our relationships, but it also might be that you're actually behind bars. And the majority of people, over 95% of people that spend time in jail or prison, they come home. And
Hmm.
so it's really built a passion in me, and God really moved in my heart to really advocate for people who make a mistake and are willing to embrace it and learn from it, and they're looking for a second chance opportunity. And and I think that that's huge, to be able to look at people for who they are as humans, realizing that no matter what, whether you're in a suit and tie and driving a Beamer, or whether you're driving a rusty pickup truck and you can barely get two pairs of jeans together, we're all broken and we're all human and we all need each other. And that's the way God designed us. And so I'm a huge advocate for second chance employment and career mobility, all the way up to ownership, even, for both people coming in reentry, but also for people that are in recovery from addiction of drugs and alcohol and things of that nature. Because everyone is a human, everyone needs help, everyone
Hmm.
needs someone in their life to speak into their life. That's why I'm a huge proponent of mentors. When I made the mistakes I made, I didn't have solid mentors. I had gurus whose books I read,
Sure.
that told me to keep charging, and all I did by keep charging was make massive blunders. And so having real people speaking real truth and real life into your life is so huge and so massive. And that's where I've learned the most. I learned more from some of the people, in a good way, that I spent time in prison with, than I've learned from people I've known for 10 plus years in business. And it had nothing to do with the crime of the matter. It had to do with how to be a human, because I was able to witness people showing other people love in one of the most broken environments anyone can ever be in. And so if it's possible there, it's possible here. And one of my passions, if you will, is to just make people aware of that and help them become that.
That's so powerful, man. And you shared a little bit of that with me. I think it's something that it is. I think it's interesting your verbiage, your choice of words, where you said, "Hey, everybody is incarcerated in some way," and I think, especially when it comes to leadership, right? When we, like you said at the very beginning, leaders end up on their own. You end up in this place, like you're incarcerated in your mind, you're incarcerated by your job. And I think it's something, it's interesting. I don't remember if I shared with you, my dad, before he passed, retired as a captain in the Colorado prison system. And oh, he did 27 years for DOC. And one of the most profound things was um, he had as many peers that he had worked with uh, speak at his funeral as he did former inmates that he helped to progress on to the next phase of life for them. And so I think that's one of those things. We look at these lines, right? It's like, well, prison captain versus inmate, Republican versus Democrat, executive versus employee. We create all of these artificial lines for ourselves in life. And I think you really said that beautifully when you said, "Hey, look, I connected with people, and you see people for being who they are, for being human." And I think that's
Well,
super,
one
super
of the
valuable.
greatest lessons of about community I ever learned was being in prison. I
Why do you
learned
say that?
more about community while I was incarcerated than I ever did when I was out up to that point, and we had a CO who died. He killed himself. He was a war veteran and had PTSD, and he ended up committing suicide. And I was where I was at the time, there's 2,000 inmates and about another 250 staff that managed that every day. And the inmates requested to do a funeral and memorial service for the CO. And there was 300 inmates that showed up for
It's
that
wild.
service. And you think that there's this going on all the time because that's what Hollywood and all these other people want to tell you about. But reality is that's humanity bumping into each other and then embracing each other in a way that, it I I shed tears that whole service. And I didn't even know the guy. I was just there because I worked in the chapel. And it's just amazing to me. These inmates would get up and tell them how profoundly this guy had changed their lives while they were behind bars. And so I can totally get when your dad passed having that type of community show up because that's real, and
Yeah.
we need so much more of that in today's world. We need realness, not
Yeah.
fakeness. We don't need TikTok influencers telling us what to buy because they have 28 different types of filters on their phone and they're not real. People need authenticity and people need reality, and they need to know that they're not alone. And as someone who's walked through what we've walked through, not only as an individual, as a family, that's really what I want to be able to share with people is like, you're not alone. You don't have to be incarcerated in your thoughts. You don't have to be held captive to these strongholds. The
Sure.
strongholds can get torn down and you can find freedom. And I saw people with more freedom when they were behind bars than I ever saw people with freedom when they weren't. And that is an amazing thing. And ultimately, it's one of the best things that ever happened to me in my life. Which is hard for some people to probably get or
You don't
believe,
see
but
that
that's
at
just
the
reality.
time. Right. Right. Well, here's something that I think is awesome. A couple things that I picked up on, and I'm gonna repeat for the benefit of people hearing, is the fact that community is not about proximity. Community is about real humanity, and so it's not like you end up in this place. And I think it was very eloquent how you said it. You said people Hollywood sees it as colliding, and it's like it's community coming together and then connecting. I think was what you said, and it's just like that's so spot on. And that's real leadership. I mean, that is real and raw, genuine leadership. And that's part of the reason like I do this show is because I want people to hear that like that's real life. You brought up, you said like that's real vulnerability and having empathy for others and authenticity, where we do everything that we look at is well, there's a filter. And you talked a lot about character and integrity and honesty and all of these things that come together and they collide to make that perfect view of what a real leader is. And the fact is, two real leaders, they don't always have it all figured out. We it's like you do the best you can with what you have. And like you commented here, you said, hey, this was a tough time in my life. And you know I think the best leaders are the ones that own up to that. And you own it, embrace it. In your case, you're saying, hey, I was incarcerated. If you're not physically incarcerated, you're trapping yourself by not admitting to those mistakes, right? And so just a really powerful piece of the conversation. We talked a lot real quick. We're kind of coming to the tail end here, but I want to make sure and ask you this because we talked about what are some leadership strengths. We talked about lots of things to do for wins. We talked about like what you did to overcome and the things you experienced with community and in that place. Are there some things that you say, hey, I would never ever look for this? And let's call them leadership weaknesses or things that just stand out like a sore thumb that you're like, yep, that's not the person. What are two or three things that you could see from where you sit that you say, this is definitely not somebody that should be in a leadership role?
Um, Someone who is not willing to be coached is a huge issue. I think, for me. But I think that's a symptom of going back to the core issues that we talked about: the
Okay. What do you
humility,
say that?
the character, the integrity, the honesty, things like that. I think, if you're uncoachable, there's probably an integrity or character issue, and you're not being humble enough to get your ego out of the way. So if you have those core principles of what you're looking for, they
Hmm.
also act as the core principles of what is unacceptable. And I think that you don't have to overcomplicate that, right? So if someone's uncoachable, that's a problem, because it goes back to humility and character. Um, Skills can be taught. I'm a big believer that skills can be taught. It's more about attitude and, your drive.
Sure.
So if there's a lack of drive or there's a bad attitude, again, that goes back to those core principles of what you're looking for. It's just now they're reflecting that that person doesn't have them. So I think it's utilizing those core things, and those core things can be different for every individual. Like you as a leader,
Sure.
Mike, might want to look at 5 other things than what Lee would want to look for, right?
Sure.
So it's whatever your core principles or your core values are. We hear a lot in the community about leading to our core values, or our company culture is based on these core values, and we live those out. Well, living those out also has the reverse effect of who we let in. And so I
It's good.
think that if you're living your core value, or your core values, your core culture, your core 5 things, it's going to be the door of who comes in and who goes out. And so that's really how I look at things, of people who I would or wouldn't want to hire. And a lot of that has to come through more than one conversation, right? It's not like you're just going to see one person one day and say, oh, I don't like them. They could be having a bad day. But I think if you work that out through a few conversations, you're going to get a pretty good feeling pretty quickly, based on those core values that you're living by or that you're seeking, whether or
Hmm.
not they align with them.
No, I love that, because it's like a pre-installed filter, right?
Mhm.
Here's who gets to come in,
Absolutely.
here's who goes out. When we're talking about leadership overall, as this is the leadership toolkit, when we're talking about the if somebody's wanting to get into leadership, because there are times that people think they want to be a leader and they may not have the skill set. I like the fact that you said that skills can be trained. I believe leadership can be trained if you have if you have good quality characteristics, like who you are at your core. Some of the skills associated with leadership can be trained, in my opinion, and that's why we
100%.
share the show. So if somebody's looking at getting into, they say, man, and we've all said this. I know I said this when I was younger in my career. Well, I wish I had a shot at that role. I wish I had a shot at this manager's title. Oh, if they put me in that position, I would do much better in here, right? I think we've all said that. Anybody with an aptitude for leadership or a desire for leadership has said those things. So if you're moving into a leadership role, if somebody's looking to move into a leadership role, Lee, would you say that leadership is more about passion or more about purpose, or is it something else entirely? What would you say?
I think it's about a combination of passion, purpose, and ultimate desire. Um, the Bible talks about aspiring to be a leader is a good thing. But at the same time, it also talks about preparing yourself for the role. And so I think
Sure.
that, if you decide, you are, say, on a sales team, and you're been doing sales for a year, and you want to lead the sales team. Well, who's leading the sales team now? What have they done? What have they done throughout their career? And you can look at their career check marks, right?
Hmm.
And that's your A level um, view of what you need to be able to do. Well, then you got to say, well, how did they do that? Well, they did that because they focused on personal development, and they focused on skilling up based on certain things that needed to be addressed, and they focused on networking and building relationships, and so now you got 5 things you got to go do. You got to start working on personal development. You got to start doing this. You got to start doing that, and then that takes time. I think the
Sure.
biggest thing in today's world is people forget things take time.
Yes. Absolutely.
And so you can be a salesman, and like I've worked in car dealerships in my life, so you can be a salesman for a car dealership at year one, and think that you're ready for finance manager. and you maybe have only sold 10 cars a month. Well, the finance manager is financing 50 to 150 cars a month. So what are you doing to get your volume up to get that level of experience on a transactional basis, right? And I'm just using that
Sure.
as an example. If you want to go out and you want to become the CEO of a small business, it isn't something you go from being the lowly administrative assistant to being the CEO. You have to start working in each area of the business. You have to start skilling up in each. Wherever there's a guy out of Louisiana named Chris Rood. He's a real estate investor, and his big thing is
Okay.
skilling up. And I think that's such a great way of putting it. You need to focus and take the time to skill up, and you need to always be learning. The continuous improvement model that a lot of companies have adopted. Um, Too many times, I think people that want to be in leadership forget that they need to do that themselves for themselves.
Sure.
There needs to be continuous improvement of who you are, what you know how to do it, and then always a continuous improvement of what's my why. My why might be, well, I make 50 grand, I want to make 60 grand. My why might be, my wife needs XYZ medical issue, right? And we
Hmm.
need to get her a doctor. My why might be, in my case, I got 8 kids. I want to see
Hmm.
them all be able to do whatever they want to do in life, whether that's college, trade school, small business, whatever that is. I want to be able to support them. Well, one of my legacy issues for me and my wife is that we want to position ourselves to be in a position to help our kids when they get older.
Sure.
It's a matter of what's your why, and then you really need to address the how. I used to have this conference room. I had wallpaper in there, and it had the
Hmm.
why. It had why in like 20 different fonts and different colors and shapes and sizes, but it also had how in the middle.
Interesting.
Like how was
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
big in the middle. And so I think that too many people are worried about the why, and that they think they can just get there, and they forget about the how, and that it takes time.
That's really good advice, because I have, like, a lot of people, when you'll talk to people, they always say, you got to find your purpose, you got to find your why. Like, that is a real conversation. I think it's very valuable, but I think you add that new dimension with finding the how. And I would advise anybody, one of the things to be aware of moving into a leadership role, the how is, you brought up, Lee, like, hey, if there's a sales leader right now, what are those characteristics? What are the things? On the flip side of that, anyone that wants to move needs to be aware, if the person that's the sales leader is not a positive influenced sales leader, or if you say, oh man, like I was saying as we led into this part of the conversation, oh, if I was in that position, I would blank, right? If that person is not a good manager, not a good leader, and you're vying for that position, you're not like pushing for it, but you're saying, hey, if I got my shot, just keep in mind that you don't always want to emulate the person that came before you. You want to find
Yeah.
good quality people, like you're saying, Lee. Find good quality, and if that person is good quality, then yes, emulate them. But if they're not, then you have to be quite deliberate in seeking out what is the skill set and what are the things that you need.
Yeah, I think you have to have the discernment to decide whether or not they're quality or not, right? And if they are quality, that could become one of your first mentors. They're
Absolutely.
already they're a step above you, right?
Hmm.
The other thing I would mention is I think too many people, when they have that why conversation, they come up with a why, and it's a good why, but
Sure.
it becomes the only why rather
Mm.
than more of a goal to accomplish, and then once it's accomplished, evolving that why into the next great thing, right? And always be in pursuit of what's the next right choice, what's the next right thing for me, for my family, for my company, for my department, whatever it is. And they get too fixated on the one why versus like, this is the why that gets us here, then we're going to redevelop the why that gets us here. And for
Love
me,
that.
that's a big step of saying taking a small business that's a startup to 1 million, and then
Hmm.
taking another business from 1 million to 5, and then you have to do a whole different level of work to go from 5 to 10 or 20. And so you're constantly, that why is constantly moving. That And then so is the how, right? Because we have to be working on our how to keep pushing our why. And
Sure.
I think that too many people are like, well, I wanted to go be a millionaire, I'm just going to go do X. And it's like, well, when that fails, what's going to keep moving you towards X? And reality is, not too many people can answer that question because they haven't had the positive why conversation, and they haven't put positive mentors in their life that are doing what they want to do. They go after the money, they go after what they perceive to be influence and perceive to be fame, rather than the guys that are really good or the women that are really good and really just pursuing, after them to be mentors and to be friends and just someone who can help lift them up.
Pursuit of the next right thing. I think you said that greatness is really good.
Yeah, I'll credit that to Mark Campo. Mark Campo is my
Yeah.
pastor and my buddy I mentioned earlier. And he said that to me. And actually, one of my other mentors who I acquired their business coaching content from, it's all about the next right step.
Yep.
When you're looking at a problem and you're really baffled about what am I going to do, you need to narrow down your options to what's the next right thing, and then continuously build on the next right thing or the next right choice. And I think if you do that, I'm not saying you won't make mistakes, but it certainly negates a lot of the mistakes that you might make otherwise.
Keeps your head in the right direction. Well, hey, we're almost an hour into this. So a couple of things. I just want to remind everybody, if you want to connect with Lee, and you should, a couple ways to do that. You can go to linkedin.com/in/Lee Partee. That's LeePartee. Or you can text him, text or call. But he mentioned earlier, text first, 216-258-2989. It's been a real pleasure having you on the show, Lee.
That's been great. I'd love to come back whenever I can.
Yeah, absolutely. So I appreciate you very much. You want to just hang out at the tail end here. Any final thoughts before before we sign off here?
No, I think I don't really have any major final thoughts. I would say that building on the next right choice and being okay with making mistakes. That's the other thing. Be willing to make a mistake. Failure is not final.
Sure.
If failure was final, I'd still be in prison. And, failure is not final. And for those of us who come from a faith basis, our failure is not final because we believe in Christ. And so
Absolutely.
I would encourage anyone who's struggling right now to reach out to, whether it's to me, whether it's to Mike, whether it's to someone in your local vicinity or in your network, be willing to reach out. And I think that no matter who you are, if someone reaches out to you, be willing to take the call. And
so good. That's so good. I love it, man. Well, thank you again for spending your afternoon with me. Just hang tight for a minute and I'll go ahead and close this out.
Thanks.
And that, my friends, is going to bring us to a close for another Leadership Toolkit podcast. Thank you so much for your time. You're invested in this and listening and learning and growing yourself, growing your leadership, because it's going to impact somebody in your circle. And do me a favor, if you would, please make sure and throw some thumbs up on this show, throw likes, share the show out, especially share this with somebody that may need to hear it. There's a message in here that will impact somebody, and you could be the catalyst for that. So I appreciate you so much for taking the time to join me and my guest Lee today on the Leadership Toolkit. Remember, I do this every Wednesday at 12:05 p.m. Mountain, 2:05 p.m. Eastern. I thank you so much. And until we speak next, be great. We'll talk soon, everybody.